It's my pleasure to have Dr. Hans Uter back on the show. Hans is a lecturer, musician, and composer. He holds a doctorate degree in ethnomusicology from the Ohio State University. He has taught at the Ohio State University, Capital University, and the Indira Gandhi National Open University. He is the author of Trance, Ritual, and Rhythm, and he has 3 books currently in press. Hans, how you doing this evening?
I'm doing great, Tim. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be back with you.
Well, yeah, thanks for coming back.
Yeah, and I wanted to mention I just have 3 new albums I just released. I got
Oh,
a
okay.
couple more coming, and that's on my. You find a link on my website, hansutter.com.
Okay. And you,
And
you have a couple websites, right?
yeah, I have one that I'm going to be updating here shortly, and that's mindcontrolmusic dot. I think it's either WordPress or Blogspot. Obviously, I think it's WordPress.com. I actually had another mirror site. Yeah, mindcontrolmusic.wordpress.com. Uh, and yeah, so
What type, what type, what type of music is it?
it's a variety of different things. There's some like original. There's a band with kind of jazz meets Indian classical music type of approach. There's another like meditation CD. There's a CD I did for a funk artist who was quite prominent in the 70s and 80s. So it's like his comeback album. And then there's another album that is sitar with analog synthesizer.
Oh,
So
okay.
experimental. So, but yeah, just some projects that I had. I finally got them released, and it's good to at least get that out in the internet sphere of commerce. So.
Well, listen. Well, we had you back because last time we touched on music, the use of music to manipulate or shape society, its weaponization, perhaps. And this is based on a couple of or several appearances, more than a couple dozen, on Jan Irvin's Gnostic Media. I guess it's Unspun, and also he did a couple series on the secret history of FM radio and music, mind control, and psychobiology. Well, last time we talked about, music as it progressed from the 50s to the 60s, the development of rock and roll, the destruction of American rock and roll, the importation of British music, the British invasion, and how that might have served a certain interest of the powers that be, and how it was weaponized to produce the 60s and some of the trauma of the 60s. And I thought maybe we'd continue the conversation, talk about how music changed or progressed into the 70s and how it affected other things like the phenomenon of the serial killer of the late 60s and 70s and some of the changes that occurred in the 1970s as opposed to the 60s. So how do you want to? It's kind of a broad topic. I had trouble thinking how would I really classify or title this discussion, because it was kind of broad and vague, but it was, so how do you want to handle this? What's the best way to get into it?
Well, there's a couple different entry points, but I'll start just from the point where the story broke that there was CIA involvement in cult activity, in pedophilia, and possibly in connections with other serial killers, and that was the Finders incident. And so the Finders, they were discovered. Basically, they were in a park. Some people observed these very mangy-looking kids, and they were described as being feral. And then there was some men in a van. They ended up calling the police, and then the police investigated and ended up discovering that they had a whole setup with video cameras. They had like torture dungeons. They had they had like types of telex machines for doing, financial transactions. And then what happened, if you look at the original reports, right, done by the police department, you actually get some information on what was happening, right? And then suddenly they came in, if I recall correctly, the FBI came in and shut this down. And so we're looking at, you have sexual orgies, also possibly human sacrifice, and, internet human trafficking. and other things like that. And so, again, they're looking at, international connections, an international network with wire transfers being made all around the world. And again, this was not technology. This was 1987. And so this technology was not something that, your average weirdo cult is going to be able to get a hold of, or being able to do this kind of, international money transfer and communication and stuff like that that were going on there. But basically, the U.S. Justice Department shut down the investigation on the grounds of national security, and they were turned over to the CIA as an internal security matter. So I think that's pretty clear that, well, it's clear that was actually a CIA run, or type. It's a combination of cult, of Satanism, pedophilia, ritual murder, etc. And so that's very interesting, because then as we track back, and there's always that level of kind of believing people would do this, right? Sometimes it's kind of hard to imagine. That's why certain issues like 9/11 or whatever, they will get that level of cognitive dissonance. But I think, since this is an absolutely documented story, I think that's a good place to start with that.
Yes, they apply their morality to groups, or maybe subcultures, or the deep state operators who may not be operating on the same moral plane as they do. So it's hard for them to accept that these things can be going on, especially with official sanction, because that's really disorienting. Because you can see if it's some dirty guy in a trench coat, some pervert, but if he's working for Uncle Sam and he's got the backing of alphabet soup agencies, that's real troublesome, especially when the Justice Department seems to be corrupted in the process. The first I heard of the Finders case was through, I guess it was Steve Gunderson, the FBI Gunderson.
Ted Gunderson. Yeah.
Ted Gunderson, yeah. And I think the kids were discovered in Florida, and they traced it up to a warehouse up in D.C. in Glover Park, which is interesting, because that's also where the punk rock scene developed out of, which had CIA connections, apparently. Yeah. Very much like the Laura Canyon scene. And there was a warehouse where a lot of the stuff were, telex machines, all types of evidence, videotapes, an altar, audio visual, these sort of things, and it was just quashed at the behest of the CIA. Gunderson himself also he also took on the case of, was it Larry McDonald, the army doctor who was charged with killing his family?
Yeah, and
remember that?
Gunderson said that basically he spent decades trying to get him released, because he was accused of the murders, but it turns out it was a cult, a satanic cult operating on the military base, and he, as far as I know, he's still in jail, but he had admissions from people describing the cult and their cult activity and doing these types of murders.
Yes.
And one thing to note is that
it's Jeffrey McDonald, not Larry McDonald. Larry McDonald was the congressman.
Yeah, I didn't. Guy's name. I'm familiar with that
Jeffrey
story.
McDonald. Yeah.
And then Gunderson also worked with the McMartin preschool, and a lot of other things. And Gunderson, there was a movement to discredit him. I've heard, some people say, oh yeah, he's dirty. I mean, I don't know per se. It would make sense also to discredit him if he was revealing this. Who knows? But the fact is, if you look at these, like say the McMartin daycare, then you have another very organized child abuse ring. You have child abuse rings occurring in Europe. Was it the Deltra affair?
Marc Dutroux, yeah.
Marc Dutroux, and they have the same, and you have similar pattern of these houses. You have people procuring stuff, and it's just really pretty ghastly stuff. But it's definitely involving murder, ritual murder, and these kind of things, and involving actually levels of state complicity. And then if you go to the the Boys Town thing, which is even more deep, in terms of that, in terms of just this, going up to the highest levels of the political establishment, being involved in these things. But we step back to the finders. With the finders, we have a very nice connection with the 1960s, in that the finders were a sort of a commune, a group, kind of supposedly agrarian, peace, love, and happiness type of a group. That the finders, though, was basically. I'm sorry, I just got it. Let me turn off my availability on my Skype, because I keep getting messages here. So I don't want to get off track. So with the finders, you have these groups, these communes, right, that are springing up all over. But while I'm sure there were some very nice communes with real leaders that were not, either extremely sketchy or involved in possibly malevolent activities. But so the finders, they were a commune that there's an outgrowth of the 1960s, and in fact, the finders themselves are one of many different types of communes that had possible links either with intelligence agencies, or at least some pretty nefarious people that were connected, or changing and manipulating their followers, which of course ties right into Manson and stuff like that. But with that evolution of finding a direct link between the commune, between which would go back into the 60s counterculture and the CIA and all of these activities, I think that would give at least a little bit of supporting evidence, for the case of going into then the development of the serial killers in the 1960s, and how that connected with all the other social cultural phenomena at the time.
Now, yes. Now with the finders, it's the founder was a United States Air Force Master Sergeant,
Mm-hmm.
Marion David Petty, who had a ninth grade education, according to reports, and he, up until at least as recent as 2000, they resided in Culpeper, Virginia, and they were known as strollers because they'd walk around town, looking at people and taking notes on people. And they found, I think, with the finders, they found, and amongst the evidence there was almost like dossiers on people, their families, their activities, their habits, almost like intelligence on people, just people in town with children, which is rather disturbing. So again, it's almost like they were acting like an intelligence operation for every reason. And I would suggest that again they were getting intelligence on maybe potential targets. So the use of these calls. I mentioned the Jeffrey McDonald case because I think, according to Gunnarsson, he believed what happened was he had run afoul of one of these groups working at the hospital on the base down there.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened was this cult group was working with the U.S. military to import drugs, to distribute drugs up and down the East Coast. And what happened was this cult, I guess, went as sort of retaliation, went and murdered McDonald's family, pinned it on him.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. military knew this, but if they were to expose that reality, they'd expose the drug operation, which was an intelligence operation. So they just, I guess, according to this, I remember it, according to Gunnarsson, is they just let McDonald take the fall for it because they got rid of evidence. Apparently, they had skin under the wife's fingernails from her trying to defend herself. That went missing, and that would have the suggestion there is the skin wasn't McDonald's, it was somebody else's, which would have been exculpatory evidence, and that went missing. Other evidence went missing too when it was investigated, just lost it. But that gives you an idea of what might be going on. Is these cult groups serve a certain function? They carry out operations for the intelligence agencies, while allowing the agencies to maintain an arm's length and give them plausible deniability. They're assets. Same thing might be suggested with a few of the serial killers.
Yeah. Well, like the finders, they are. There's some evidence that they are an outgrowth of the merry pranksters, right? And so that will take us back to the 60s. We'll jump back there in a second, but yeah. And so I mean, you have this. There's an aspect of the intelligence operations. Now, I would not say, depending on the organization, right? I mean, like for example, you have people that are influenced, right? Or you can, especially with this model of these kind of top-down groupings, right? It's very, very easy to manipulate people. It's very easy to reprogram them. And so, you're using that also as an asset. And you just need, well, look at the Jonestown massacres. He was, besides a few core people, Jim Jones was running the whole op himself pretty much with, a couple people behind the scenes, but everyone else was believing in this organization, right? And they were all, obviously, they didn't go out and commit serial murders, but on the other hand, they all, a lot of them may have been assassinated too, but that's an example of these kinds of groupings where, you're able to create behavior patterns in individuals as well. And then a lot of times, people get sucked up into something, and especially if you're involved in, lots of LSD use and stuff, a lot of these people become completely whacked out, and and they have no sense of reality anymore whatsoever, or their minds have been very largely programmed, or else they're brought into the occult arena, this arena of the power of the blood sacrifice, of all this stuff, and basically they move into that space, and they accept that space, and then they become part of it. So in these organizations, you don't need many agents actually, as long as
you don't. Yeah,
hierarchical structure, right? And especially, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but especially in the traumatic, conclusion of the hippie dream, so to speak, and even during that time, you have people that are suddenly, going into these, realms of consciousness, whatever they are, but they are having these, whether spiritual experiences, communal experiences, but then they can no longer relate to the world around them. And they're very much open for connecting on a spiritual plane and all this stuff, because, they're high in LSD all the time, or they're just in that space, but they're also lost because there's no structure. They didn't go through some kind of a structured program, like say someone who is like what Aldous Huxley and Owsley talks about is, you could, if you want to suppose, they talk about these siddhis, or, spiritual powers, in the yogic scriptures and in Buddhism, but it, could take you 10 years. You may never have an experience. So just take LSD and then you can have these powers and see all these realms. Well, actually the difference is this, that even if, whether you choose or not to believe in developing higher powers or potentials of the mind, if it takes you 10 years and you're engaged in some kind of disciplined activity that's grounding you, it's far different from instantly being thrown into this sort of psychic space. And at the same time, in that psychic space, it's very easy to program symbols, imagery, things like that start to transmute the person, internally. And so, we can go back to these revelations of this stuff with Gunnarsson, but I think that's, so these serve multiple purposes, and they also serve as a way to catch people who are lost. You can bring them into these organizations. And at the same time, these organizations can create fear. You get that divide. You're creating even in the local town where the commune may reside or whatever, you still have this kind of clashing social system, in the midst of another environment. And so you're creating that intersocietal tension. Obviously a group like the Finders or the Manson family is going to create a lot more intersocietal tension than say, the Transcendental Meditators in Iowa or something. But basically that's, I think so. And I could even go list more layers to this, but I think also sometimes not in the case of the finders, but it's a lot. Sometimes the revelation of these events and the encoding of these events in the public mind, in the media, et cetera, also serve to amplify them. So it's a process of amplifying the ritual. It's a process of amplifying the mind control activities. It's a process of amplifying fear or other types of agendas that are being pursued.
You mentioned Jim Jones, Jonestown, and the People's Temple. Well, Jonestown appeared to be some sort of outdoor mass trauma mind control operation with ties to the CIA. That's evidenced by Jim Jones's relationship or friendship with one Dan Micciarone. He was a former police officer, FBI agent, who'd become a contractor or an advisor to the CIA. He apparently was involved in training South American police departments or interior departments in the art of torture. And he was involved in various CIA's dirty wars down there in South America and Latin America in the 50s and 60s. Well, he was eventually kidnapped, I think, in Uruguay and murdered by his captors. But another thing we get with Jim Jones is the intersection between Jim Jones, CIA, and electoral politics, because Jim Jones was sort of a power broker in San Francisco politics, but he was put in control of the Housing Commission by Mayor Moscone in San Francisco, and well, the mass suicide or murders that occurred in Jonestown and the alleged suicide of Jim Jones occurred not too long before, I think it was a week before the assassination of Moscone and Harvey Milk by that former police officer Dan White, who was able to plead the Twinkie defense and got off on manslaughter or something. And of course, he died 7 years later of a heart attack. So that's interesting. But also, basically, what it looks like is it was some sort of cleanup operation. And another thing is, just like Jim Jones's childhood is all many indications of his childhood he had suffered neglect or abuse, and that might be why he himself seemed to exhibit the disassociation or psychological disorders that we associate with abuse, serial abuse. So, I mean, that's pretty interesting because we also have a long history of the CIA's use of cults for certain operations, and that's what Jonestown appeared to be.
Yeah, no, that's very it's very interesting in that and this I guess we can maybe, I don't know if this is the time to jump back to the 1960s, but this development, as I'm sure most listeners are familiar with, the whole MK Ultra and going back to Project Bluebird, Project Artichoke, and other many of these other sub projects and different things. So there was a tremendous amount of research on this stuff, on the idea of mind control, on the idea of either individually or collectively induced trauma. And this was studied, within a whole variety of different contexts involving, different types of pharmacological agents, as well as everything you could think of. And of course, Ewan Cameron is one of the classic examples of that, of his de-patterning, where he kept people in comas for weeks and weeks or months even, and just basically erased their minds completely, and then reprogram them. And we found out about that because he was up in Canada, and I think McGill University, and he, people came and they started getting fragments of their memories coming back, and then they were able to do some kind of lawsuits. But I mean, people literally lost their entire memories. They lost the ability even to use the bathroom. They became like infants again, and this idea of de-patterning, of the stimulation, through different types of psychic driving, basically with this continual environment of all this types of specific sensory stimuli, is remarkably like what the Merry Pranksters were doing with their acid tests, and is also a little bit analogous to this. I think it's a 1954 memo connected with I don't have in front of me here, but this is connected with or kind of early MK Ultra, and they talk about using this experimenting on large social groupings, adding this the elements of sociology, anthropology, and implementing this on a society-wide basis as well as an individual-wide basis, right? And Ewan Cameron was not a fringe figure. He was president of the World Psychiatric Association, the American Psychopathological Association, the Society of Biological Psychiatry, president of the Canadian Psychiatry, et cetera. So he was very much, an acclaimed figure in the mainstream, just, in terms of mental health and in terms of the entire world, but at the same time, he was engaged, in these extremely, studies that show an absolute disregard for human life. There were many people that were in the mental hospital for depression, for minor issues, and they had their minds absolutely erased. But he did work on, and he was also in the Nuremberg trials, right? And he talked about the social reorganization of Germany and the transformation and erasure of the mind, and basically that was one of his early works in the 40s. And then he did talk about the idea, this necessity of basically erasing the German psyche so they don't become Nazis again.
But that's consistent with like the Morgenthau plan.
Yeah.
And also the attempt, the idea that there's something fundamentally wrong with the German psyche, and how it had to be erased. That's interesting. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and that's in the Nuremberg trials, but that's his early work. But he was very much. So he was, again, his studies at McGill were not known about until you have, these very, very tragic, I find to be, really heart-wrenching stories. Like there's a woman who was there because she had postpartum depression, and then she became an entirely new person. She didn't know her kids. She completely forgot her life. She lost the ability, she was a musician. She lost the ability to play music. She had these, some little resurgence of some types of memories, and they were able to trace back that she was involved in Ewan Cameron's program. But so at the same time, you have these people, chained down to these beds with flashing lights and tape messages, and injected with massive doses of LSD and sleeping agents. At the same time, he very much believed that it was behavioral scientists, psychiatrists should be the social planners of society on a worldwide basis. And he looked at certain models of human behavior to be dangerous and outmoded, especially authoritarianism, of course, and things like that. And so there was the idea of destruction of types of social models. And he said that Germans were likely to commit atrocities because of their historical, biological, racial, and cultural past and their psychological nature. But if you go a little bit further in his career, he did a lot of work with social psychiatry, interpersonal relationships, looking at family and community, and actually working not only with he had something called intrapsychic, right? So he's working on, or as the Mary Pranksters say, possibly intersubjective type of, society. So, and so basically, when you go back to this idea of depatterning of, and basically that of these other intelligence operations, you can tie this into much larger global geostrategic movements. You can tie it in with the, obviously assassination of Kennedy, et cetera, et cetera. But you look at the track, you go back to Bernays. And so that's kind of the beginning of this, which is obviously this is taking the Freudian concept of the unconscious and using that for advertising, using that for public relations, using that to guide the control society. With MK Ultra, Cameron, the search for the Manchurian candidate, so to speak, and especially a lot of the absolute mounds of research done in the Soviet Union. You've got Pavlov and all these other people doing lots and lots of research on these types of conditioning mechanisms. You have a move from the sort of Freudian. You could look at it as a difference between going to a Freudian therapist and then going to a psychiatrist and getting doped with drugs. So you have a combination of an evolution of the model, which is much as bad as it is having making a bunch of debutantes smoke. It's much worse when you start to manipulate the neurological structures and a much deeper level of human dynamics, especially working from described as a behaviorist model, sort of very much a mechanistic model of society. And so, but you see, just like with Freud, Cameron, he believed that the family itself was where all the social behavior, anxieties, all these complexes, and all the problems in society were coming from the family. And just there's the whole thing with the '60s, this idea of leaving your family, the idea of creating this discontent between the generations and having people leaving their family and setting out and creating these new types of family structures is very much connected with Cameron's ideas. And so this idea of replacing the old, replacing all these conditioning and these things that are keeping us down, which seems kind of like a little bit like the '60s in terms of, hey, the man's keeping us down. We've got to free our minds from our parents' generation. But he did believe in this idea that this interpsychic, right? So he believed that you could have people as carriers of particular vectors of consciousness. And again, intersubjectivity, LSD experience. He believed that, like, say, for example, mentally ill musicians playing mentally ill rock music could produce mentally ill people through their affection, through their affliction, and basically looking at that as a contagious social disease. And he believed that this would become a genetic phenomena, right? This would eventually transform the genetic material. And so he definitely, again, this idea of a social contagion and setting up carrier agents to go into the society and transform that society. With a lot of these people, they'll also look at it as let's prevent this from happening. On the other hand, if you look at this idea of reworking the social and et cetera, I think you can see Cameron is very much, a very important figure, not only because he had the ability to shape large organizations of behavioral scientists, psychiatrists, psychologists, sociologists, et cetera, through his extremely prominent positions. He was also very much working with counterintelligence, with, interrogation tactics, and, then reprogramming the psyche. Electroconvulsive therapy. This is going 57 to 64. And also, this, this was, again, definitely a sub-project of MK Ultra. And if you look at his work, and then suddenly in 1964, and I'm not saying that there's a direct connection at all, because then I would be crazy. No, but in 1964, then you suddenly have the Merry Pranksters show up and drive across the country distributing LSD to the country. And he, and Cameron used quite a bit of LSD in his work. And so, and they also, they used all kinds of stuff. They used electromagnetic signals, radio frequency signals, so, and then from there, I know. Believe me, we'll get to the serial killers in a second. From there, just looking at the evidence, and hopefully maybe have some more evidence that the Merry Pranksters were the finders evolved out of the Merry Pranksters. But let's go to the Merry Pranksters, set up by Ken Kesey. Ken Kesey was on a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship at Stanford. He was kind of the all-American boy, very clean-cut, athletic, very self-confident, really like, I mean, just the again all-American kid, and was while he's studying at the university, studying creative writing, he started being involved in MK Ultra experimentation as a guinea pig at Menlo Park. As well as his friend Ken Babbs, who was also Ken Babbs was in the military, and he was the right hand man of Ken Kesey, and they were all involved while they're studying creative writing. They were all he and his friend, as well as like Allen Ginsberg was there, and some other people were involved in his testing. And he managed to smuggle the LSD out of this testing facility, and began in his residency. I'm forgetting the name of the street, but in Palo Alto, also home of the Stanford Research Institute, he began holding these parties with his famous Ken's chili, which was laced with LSD. And so this is a little bit.
Was it Perry Lane?
Perry Lane, that's correct. Yep, yeah, Perry Lane.
Yeah, Perry. Got to remember because some people think Penny Lane is.
Yeah, I knew it was. Perry Lane. So he had his house out there, and serving up the chili, and people were getting involved in LSD, and then you have I won't go too many details. And you have Neil Cassidy, then you have this direct link of the two countercultures, right? You're linking the East Coast and the West Coast. You have a direct passing of the torch from the beatniks, and in fact, Neil Cassidy was the archetypal free American in Kerouac's writing. He was Dean Moriarty, and Dean Moriarty represented this primal American freedom. Myself, I read On the Road, when I was quite young, and it seems kind of inspiring. It seems, oh, this is great, and so then you have, these Ken Kesey and his friend also, they said they were, huge fans of Neil Cassidy. So suddenly you have this archetype. And out of the blue, they decided to take this bus, paint it day glow, psychedelic colors. He was able to sell his book, One Who Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, suddenly got a huge windfall of money, supposedly inspired by taking LSD, when he was working as an orderly in a mental hospital, and realizing that perhaps the society is insane and the mental patients are sane, which we find a number that becomes a very prominent theme in the 60s in a lot of different areas, this idea of madness or insanity actually being sane, or even the idea of wanting to experience madness as freedom, as psychic space. Anyways, Kesey, had this huge bestseller and was able to fund this trip. And basically they again, 64, not long after the Kennedy assassinations, they drove all the way across the country, distributing LSD, basically showing they were basically the whole hippies. I mean, they didn't necessarily look like hippies on the bus, but, again, the psychedelic day glow art, everything just kind of came right there, out of the box. It's almost like, oh, here you go. It wasn't like, it didn't evolve over years. It just kind of evolved over months. And that became sort of the style for the whole, it set the entire hippie style and movement, which is still with us today, right? You have the jam band circuit, you have all this stuff. So this is not a passing cultural phenomenon, but it, with the communal living and all these other things. So during their journeys, they went around and they had these tape, machines. They had all this high tech equipment, and they filmed and documented their whole thing. And then they came back and started the acid tests. And I think with the acid tests, that, as I was talking before we started the show, I've just been kind of shocked at the paucity of critical material on these events. The music that I've heard from the events, the video footage, they seem to be extremely, not that I'm a pussy, so to speak. I hate to use that term, but that was basically the idea. Can you pass the acid test? Are you man or woman enough to do this? But what they were doing is ingesting massive amounts of LSD with all kinds of strobe lights and weird sound effects coming out and in projection screens. You have Ray Seaburn doing all this projection stuff. You have the Grateful Dead, playing their music that they played at the time, which was, just kind of watered down, rip off Chicago blues with meandering guitar solos or whatever. But I mean, I guess they did a lot of experimental music, but they became the house band, and their original name was the Zodiacs, and then they changed to the Warlocks, and then they became the Grateful Dead. So we'll hear just around the time the Zodiac started, which we'll get into in a second. Mm-hmm. But anyways, so during these Mary Prankster acid tests, there was well, I don't know, I won't play the clip, but I came across some stuff from Owsley Stanley, and he describes this as extremely dark energy. He said they were engaged in witchcraft. They were summoning like demonic energy and demonic spirits. He thought it was like, he told Kesey, you don't know what you're getting into. This is extremely dangerous. And he describes this experience, and just being, just seeing that they were, basically tapping in. He saw it as this basically giant occult ritual space utilizing psychedelics, not as the happy-go-lucky, fun times, just kids just freaking out and just being free and whatever, which is, again, people describe it as peace and love. Oh, it's so positive. And, Allen Ginsberg, Tim Leary, everybody, they just talk about how it's so wonderful and this pagan celebration of humanity. And Ram Dass, Richard Alpert says, well, there were not really any freakouts there. People just weren't ready to surrender completely. Well, you look at it, you've got the actual music, again, with these crazed lights that were set up to be asynchronized with the music. So you're creating this asynchrony effect. And that was something that Ken Kesey liked to do, was take tape delays that would he looked at this perceptual lag. I guess one of his goals was he said that, all our actual perceptions are always delayed by 1/30th of a second. He was trying to shatter that distance between immediate experience and when our brains register it. And so he used, tape delays so when you try to speak, you can't, you hear your own words back and suddenly you can't even think anymore. But he was trying to, I don't know how, by having all these, but basically part of it was this asynchrony, and then a very bizarre, disturbing, noise, tape music coming in, along with the Grateful Dead, noodling around. And then you have some of the recordings. I mean, you see these things deliberately designed to induce paranoia. That was part of it, pass the acid test. Can you induce paranoia states? For Ken Babbs to be like, you are busted. I am, Voltron, which, sounds kind of silly and fun. But if you've just taken, 300 milligrams of LSD or whatever, micrograms, you're highly suggestible. So with that, Mary Pranksters, you find a little bit of this tinge of the evil, not evil, but darkness to a certain extent. And then I'll just give a couple anecdotes. Ken Kesey, was, very laissez-faire. When people went insane, even when they were driving on the bus, they just drop people off. Someone's on the bus, they have a nervous breakdown, they just leave them in the town. There was one lady who, known as, I think, Naked Girl or whatever. She lost her, went nuts and was running around naked. They just abandoned her in some town in America. There's a story related by Hunter S. Thompson and Tom Wolfe, the biographer, so to speak, the new journalist who basically, describing a gang rape by the Hells Angels. And they said, oh, well, it was her movie. And she seemed to like her movie. And so, and there's many others. And it's, again, of people, going insane. And even when Owsley Stanley, who a couple weeks later actually began manufacturing LSD for the Merry Pranksters and the acid test, he after his disturbing experience, seeing all these basically the demonic or very dark and very powerful, potent energies they were associating, he freaked out and drove off and actually almost got killed in a car wreck. And Kesey just laughed at him. He survived. He was okay, but Kesey just he said he was not very happy with the fact that Kesey looked at it as a joke, that he drove off the road into a ditch and could have driven off a cliff quite easily. So there was always this, behind the peace and love. I say even at the very beginning of the whole '60s psychedelic movement, they're again, these hippies, or at least those in command, have a very disdainful, I would describe as a non-compassionate take to people that have lost their minds because of this stimulation. And the last thing I just want to say is that if you look at this from the Ewan Cameron model, not only are you doing psychic driving, not only are you doing this sensory overload, and you're having all kinds of weird messages being implanted in people, but you're also developing a collective psychosis, possibly, or collective types of psychic energies, which he believed could be transmitted. And then you have them driving across country, and then then you have just then the '60s explode from out of that whole movement.
Now, a couple observations. One thing that's interesting, you point out the Ewan Cameron, the idea of social contagion. The idea that one approach could be try to prevent it or provide a remedy for it, but it can also be weaponized like a bioweapon. The same way maybe the CDC or the military may be looking to develop a vaccine or a cure for something, but you can very easily reverse engineer it and weaponize it. The way that some people believe that they weaponized cancer in the early '60s in the process of dealing with the polio vaccinations, and the fact that it had SV40 virus in it, and they thought, well, if we can accelerate it and weaponize it, and we can use it. It's almost as if they're using, if you're identifying a social contagion or some sort of bacillus, if you will, instead of trying to prevent it, you can encourage it and in a sense weaponize it to achieve some sort of social political objective. That's interesting. Yeah. Now, another observation is you mentioned Ewan Cameron, and we've been talking about the finders, and I came across this article in October 1977. NBC TV broadcast a segment entitled "The Children and the CIA." Huh. It brought out another possible covert link between the CIA and children. The CIA story was that they had simply brought a group of children together for observation at a number of summer camps for possible later recruitment to watch their behavior. However, there are disturbing barbs to the story. One in which the counselors were not told if the camp was being financed by the CIA. The agency once again used the front organization called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. This was the same group that paid Dr. Cameron for his Canadian mind-blanking experiments in the 1960s. Considering the track record of the CIA, to suspect ulterior motives in this case would only be common sense. Now, that's, of course, that suggested that perhaps the Finders was a similar program, based on the similar program where you bring kids together. And of course, the Finders' claim was they were finding children, I guess. So that's an interesting link. You have the Human Ecology Fund being tied to this operation, which may be linked to a similar program, which with the Finders.
And also linked with all these guys coming out of Stanford, the Stanford Research Institute. Have the whole Aquarian conspiracy. You have ties in with Tavistock and all that, but there's even a quote from Mountain Girl, one of the Mary Prankster, said that one of the brother, or my brothers, I think she said her brother or someone's brother, borrowed this highly expensive strobe apparatus from the Stanford Research Institute to take to the acid test. So
how nice of them.
Yeah, I mean, but right there, then suddenly you see this whole depatterning of social things, and then this could actually, I can go in a lot of different directions, but just to say this, if you look at the book The Aquarian Conspiracy, and then you have the changing images of man, the Aquarian Conspiracy is a book where they talk about the need for removing outmoded patterns of thought in society and integrating new, basically a whole bunch of new age or all kinds of different things. But and even the same thing with the changing images of man. They very much talk about breaking the past, destroying and pushing people into these new social configurations and organizations. And then you look at Ewan Cameron's beliefs in the 40s when he's talking about this. And if you expand this idea of say, JFK representing another example of a top-down authoritarian, not say authoritarian, but this type of social structure, with the strong family values. If you see the family
patriarchal.
Patriarchal,
Yeah.
patriarchal, but not even patriarchal per se, but just the family itself and the larger societal organization. If you look at seeing this idea of the German society needing to be erased and depatterned and deprogrammed, you could maybe, depending on how wide you cast that net and what you actually mean by these factors, that could easily be applied to America to a certain extent if you wanted to depattern America. I'm not saying that we have direct evidence, but the Human Ecology Fund, and then Stanford and all this stuff, and you look at what they actually were doing, you can certainly see a nice correlation, whether or not it was just exactly as Ken Kesey says, and it was just this great happy-go-lucky time, and he was, the archetypal American. They also clothed themselves in American flags. They were flying American flags, and all this stuff. And, again, distributing LSD, starting these little LSD things all over the country. And in fact, a big thing at that time was dosing people without their knowledge. Like Owsley was known to go around with this spray bottle, just spray people in the mouth with, huge amounts of LSD. Just if they didn't want to, he was just dosing people all the time.
Yeah.
And this was a common practice. But I definitely agree that
one other thing is you mentioned this attempt to depattern America, society in general, and this links back to Ewan Cameron and his involvement in Nuremberg and the trial of the Nazi leadership. I had a recent interview with Joe Atwell, and he was linking the American Jewish Committee and the authoritarian personality to MK Ultra. And the idea behind the American Jewish Committee and their authoritarian personality, which came out of the Frankfurt School, was that the source of fascism in America was the traditional family. So in order to prevent fascism or to do away with fascism in America, is you have to destroy the traditional nuclear family, and in particular the male role model, the father figure. And so that's very consistent with that. And why I mention that is that we hear a lot about MK Ultra and paperclip Nazis, but if you do the research, there are as many Jews involved in MK Ultra. They're all paperclip Nazis. So there's an odd alliance there.
Yeah. Well, this idea of the authoritarian personality. This was a big component of the 1960s, countercultural, the philosophical foundations. And this idea of you're creating a sense that the youth are trapped in this beaver cleaver world, and this is from various rock artists even talk about this. So they're trapped in this boring artificial construct, and the kids are they have to be free from this. Then we have to. So you're exposing them to these pathways of freedom, and again breaking from the conditioning of the society that was so evil as to the atrocities of World War II or whatever. This whole idea of industrialized society as being evil, as the authoritarian personality being the root of that evil, and deconstructing it and destroying it, or molding it from within, was a long. Has a long history in terms of the implementation on worldwide, but primarily in America, at least in kind of the forefront of that to a certain extent. And so, and the belief that somehow liberation through excess, through sexuality, through you have Eros and civilization, Herbert Marcuse, you have, of course, Kinsey. And the Kinsey Report is also a very important part of this. You have the Royal F. Playboy magazine. You have, all these other things. And so Kinsey, right there with Kinsey, we have another little tie-in with Rockefeller-funded research and, pedophilia and all kinds of other things. I don't know if we talked about Kinsey before, but Kinsey was another one of these people, which I don't have the evidence to prove it right now in terms of what was really going on with the Merry Pranksters, except for a few scattered little sound bites. But with Kinsey, who is still believed to be this amazing, figure and this revolutionary guy. Not only did he, utilize, drug addicts and criminals and sexual deviants for his population sample, but he was paying off pedophiles for their reports, and did incredibly disgusting, masturbating an 8-month-old baby for 24 hours straight, and describing how it kept passing out and going into convulsions as being an orgasm. Then you have Wilhelm Reich, the idea of the orgasm, again, breaking free from this authoritarian personality, this idea of, we're conditioned, we're not free, we're going to be led down to the path of global destruction because of this past system. In all of its various permutations and social, governmental, cultural structures and legacies. And so,
and they're being promoted by the establishment. You mentioned Rockefeller, but also Time magazine is putting Kinsey on the cover several times. And I think even the New York Times, although William Reich was long since dead by the late 60s, they're putting his name on the front page of the New York Times.
Yeah. And I think that's, that this idea of, as I always say, I don't mind that there's now, I think in Germany, they're trying to introduce 60 different genders. I mean, I think that is great. Multiplicity is so important, I just love it. But, the fact is that,
why are you so old fashioned? I want 65.
Okay. Oh, I'm trans-tricurious now. I just said that when I brought that up is that if you look at what's happened to our culture and society, things like that would never have been possible, probably even in the 80s or 90s. You know what I mean? So we're witnessing things now that are taking place on a mass social level. All these, look at the new student movements for these idiotic, politically correct, absolutely, imbecilic endeavors that they're using the tried and true radical methods of the 60s, whatever. But for just absolutely, if you're protesting a war, at least that, obviously that's a very good idea to try to stop a war. But the idiotic, politically correct type of protest, you see this real disconnect. But at the same time, you see this violence coming from this, the left, especially like say, Trump supporters, whatever. You see a lot of these, people. You see a lot of violence and aggressive action from the left, which has now become absolutely intolerant in a lot of ways. At least certain segments of the left have become, they're supposed to be tolerant and liberal, but they're actually moved into this other dimension. So you see that the society, the erosion of the social has, we're witnessing it right now as it continues on and on. But, to go back to that earlier statement. So this idea of, the LSD, the expansion of consciousness, the breaking free from moral restrictions, the personal freedom, sexual exploration was a huge part of the 1960s. You have, sexual liberation. So just as you have the LSD, you also have the birth control pill, and you have the residual effects, the ripple effects of the Kinsey report now becoming, part of the the mainstream culture. To say this, like there's nothing, there's always going to be people that will probably want to expand their minds and take hallucinogenic drugs, or there's always people that are involved in heavily involved in sexual activity, and there's been different small scale organizations for centuries, things like that. There's always been as sadomasochism in certain weird quarters of New York City or whatever. You can always find these small kind of deviant segments of the population, but when you have this mass promotion of these ideas. And again, you made a very important point with the media. The LSD, you have the Wasson mushroom issue in Life magazine. Mm-hmm. I think that was 58 or something. And then you look at, I have a clip. I can show you where there's a nice little promo clip done in early 1967 on the Grateful Dead, where they're not really well known. They're just kind of these Haight Ashbury guys, and it's a TV clip, but you have this very psychedelic meaning we just enter into the cosmic realm with these people. They live in this freedom, and every moment is divine, And it's like this breathless narration, and this little TV episode concludes with like, "This must be the way. This is the way. You must follow us. And it had this repeats like multiple times. And I was like, this is on TV, pre Summer of Love. You're seeing that this is not something that's being suppressed. This is not something that is not being promoted. This is something that is being distributed through the media, through the mass communication networks, and entering into the public consciousness. Then you have, of course, as I mentioned, the pranksters driving around the country. You have electric Kool-Aid acid tests, which is again this, so how many people were encouraged to take LSD from reading that book? Probably hundreds of thousands, millions, maybe. How many people? You read that book, you get this idea that this was the real freedom. This is, and not only is it human freedom, but this is the vanguard of human evolution. You are participating in the adventure, the great American dream, the dream of, and then you can move that into the Aquarian conspiracy, changing faces of man or images of man. You move into this idea that, you're actually helping bring about a new golden age and save the planet and save humanity and and this had, and so all these different levels are embedded in there. Not only stimulus for this positive, believing you can transform the world, but also the license to indulge, the license to, do what you want to do, break from your family and do everything in absolute freedom and just explore, man. And, again, the Hells Angels are gang raping a woman and everyone's just watching it. And, oh, that's her movie. That's a weird movie she's in, and that's just like, to me, and again, and this is brushed under the carpet by Tom Wolfe, and says, "Oh, this is cool, no big deal," and that to me, right there, you see this not only a blurring of the quote unquote authoritarian personality. However, even though let's look at all these rock stars as being group leaders, as in a sense authoritarian personalities. Let's look at Ken Kesey. Let's look at Timothy Leary. In a sense, even though you're going against the authoritarian personality, you're still using a model of the family with a patriarchal leader. But it's no longer in the terms of a grounded heritage or tradition or your genetic parents. It's in this new dispersed family, which becomes very similar to a cult. So, anyways, I'll let you chime in there.
Yeah, it's leading towards a atomization society, a divide and conquer. Once the individual is cut off, he is deracinated, cut off from his family, his extended family, his community. He no longer has any institutional protections against the corporations or the power structure, the centralizers, and the centralizers are the ones that they're the ones that broke up the ethnic neighborhoods in order to weaken, particularly the Catholic Church. They're the one. This is all done in the name of integration and freedom, of course, like it always is. But they create this diaspora into suburbia, where then the youth can be subjected to the psychological warfare and advertising and the music and all these things. You mentioned some of the social justice warriors in college and some of the nonsense they're protesting and their intolerance. None of these kids in college would be in this condition if they had stable, healthy family lives. Just that since the trauma of the 1960s, the objective is to weaken the family, to traumatize society, to create higher rates of divorce, family dissolution, illegitimacy. This creates higher rates of sexual abuse, of physical abuse, or just trauma, of sort of alienation. So when these kids get to be adults, or a lot of them also are raised in daycare, so they're not very that creates a certain psychological effect. Some people say it creates sort of the desire to get attention. So you have so many kids experiencing these things. By the time they reach adulthood, they haven't lived healthy childhoods. They haven't gone out and gotten cuts and bruises and explored and experimented. The things that early generations did. They weren't so parented. I mean, weren't so parented. Later generations are overparented. You heard the concept of the helicopter parent. Ironically, the helicopter parent, the kid is more neglected than the previous generations because he's institutionalized. But a lot of what you're seeing now in colleges now are kids that have never learned anything in terms of conflict resolution or dealing, with fights on the playground when they're kids and the normal, things we experience as we come of age. So we have this class now that's feels very entitled, and they have no sense of I guess of real tolerance, of respect for free speech, you know, and they can be very easily corralled and manipulated, So
Yeah, and you have this the freedom, right? I mean, this is the irony, so to speak, is that you know again when I trying to do some new research on this, so I forced myself to I watched all these different videos, things on the 60s. I'm just trying to pull up this more material, and you just see this spin of this, I mean, okay, you can act silly and put loudspeakers in trees and just, take huge amounts of psychedelic drugs and, have your senses deranged by, a whole bunch of, photic driving and audio driving and whatever. And is that, and then you can, freak out the society and do all these other things. Is that freedom? Is this the freedom becomes freedom to rebel? The freedom becomes freedom to go in your little what do they call them? Your safe place.
Yeah, safe space. Yeah.
If so, your safe space. If someone gives you a microaggression or something, yeah, and that's. I mean, it's partially it's an entitlement, but it's also, when I was teaching in a university. And my friend is, teaching, now I hear this stuff all the time. I mean, the kids are just have no sense. They absolutely demand that they get their way in a certain way. And so you have this, I'm sure there's lots of healthy families out there, but, you have, a combination of, the other freedoms, right? Let's make women free, and I think women should be barefoot and pregnant. I'm just kidding. but that's feminism is another example of that. In that, okay, well, ultimately we have Gloria Steinem, who was now an admitted CIA agent running this feminism, and then so this is again part of the '60s. One of the many strands coming out of this freedom, but what results in what? You have broken families. You have an absolute attack on the male. You have an attack on the male, just even as being a father figure, and that's, black, white, whatever. I mean, there's actually been extensive attacks on the black male as well. And so it's not necessarily, distributed, but I mean, certainly whiteness or white men as well. But I mean, you end up with, society where women are actually, a lot of them are unhappy. They get their corporate jobs. They decide they don't need to have kids. They don't want to be part of a family, and they dedicate their lives to having a career. And believe me, I've spent time with somebody. A lot of them are extremely bitter and very unhappy. And then the kids, again, are raised in daycare through one of these freedoms. It wasn't, well, is that really a freedom? No, that became another type of bondage, which basically, you were able to cut wages in half. So you have two earners. And then at the same time, you get to take the child out of the home. And then you create this divide between men and women. And of course, to fast forward to today, there's gender as a construct. I mean, look at this. I may have talked about this before, but Bruce Jenner and all this other bullshit. Sorry to say. I mean, who cares? Who cares? Who gives a damn what your identity is? You have a chromosomal, a biological, a physiological, and a neurological structure. There's always been people that are transvestites or whatever, or this and that, but it's they're not being oppressed. They're not being suppressed. And, a lot of times that can be a sign of mental illness or some type of trauma as a child. But in fact, you can raise kids to become transvestites very easily. And that's what's being done. And again, following from this idea of freedom, of the erasure of common sense societal parameters and structures. And
like separate bathrooms.
yeah, you know, and I believe me, I've been to so many places now that this is all over the country. I was traveling around. There's so many places. It's all one bathroom. But here's the thing, like, I mean, I don't, you know, I feel bad if, you know, if a woman is using a restroom, I don't want to go. I mean, women usually are a little more, you know, have a different sense of cleanliness in a restroom. And so
Yes.
I think that's not pleasant for women if there's a bunch of guys going in the restroom. But how is that freedom? What that is doing, you see this idea of shattering the idea of freedom that's coming from, I should send you some pictures. I was at San Francisco, the Federal Reserve Building there. They have these two sculptures on either side of the Federal Reserve Building. And there's one, Hermes and Dionysus, but in this case, it's sliced in all these segments. You have the sculpture, it's a metal sculpture, sliced into like 11 different segments, right? And there's another sculpture on the back the same way, but this is this idea of creating freedom by fracturing, by splitting, by dividing, and that's why you have 60 genders. But it's the same thing. You know, of course, it's good to have choices and good to do this and explore. But when you bring into the, you know, the collective mind this experience that there is no, you know, there are no boundaries. There's millions of choices, just like there's millions of websites, and there's nothing is real except for what you decide it to be, which to me sort of sounds a bit like the LSD experience and the motto of these explorers. And so, anyways, and then from that I'll just segue back into our ostensible topic here, which is so given this idea of the setup of the social system and the structure, and promoting different events, and the 1960s as being, you know, from the JFK assassination being the initial trauma. And then you have this very rapid change in the culture. And I've heard this from so many people. The hippie movement just came out of nowhere, right? I mean, you look at 50s rock, this had you can see the evolutionary process of that. And but the psychedelic rock movement really came out of nowhere. And that's what people said. It came out of nowhere. But just as this unfolded around the 64, beginning in 64, 65, and of course the Summer of Love in 1967, at the same time you have the secondary degree. You have this movement from the mass collective trauma of JFK to this sudden freedom of sexual exploration of consciousness, you know, breaking free from the family, doing exactly what you want to do, you know, returning to the primitive tribal systems, you know, basically do your own thing, and all that. Suddenly you have the interjection, which I'm arguing that was there from the outset of these ideas of forces of darkness, right? You have the Satanic Church being founded. You have the you know, Rosemary's Baby, of course. You have, and then you suddenly have all these. Then you have Altamont, and you have these bookends to the culture, and all these dates are quite interesting. A lot of these dates have other significances to them, other significations for some of these events, which align with this initial trauma, the shattering of movement. It's almost like if you look at, you know, you're being worked over by an interrogator. You know, maybe you walk in there and they beat you up, and then they give you a beer and a chicken sandwich, and they, you know, let you go walk around in the yard, and then once you feel safe after that initial trauma, because you can implement those ideas, right? You can, those minds are open. Then once they get this state of freedom or happiness, then you start with the next stage of the trauma, which I would argue could be seen as the serial killer phenomenon.
Yes. Well, the serial killer phenomenon coincides with the Vietnam War, late 60s, early 1970s. And within the Vietnam War, the CIA ran the Phoenix program. This was ostensibly a counterinsurgency program targeting the Viet Cong. And what it involved within the program was this policy of going in with special op forces or black op forces into various villages in the countryside and massacring the inhabitants and leaving a grisly scene behind for the men to come to find when they come back. This was designed to demoralize and paralyze the villagers who were suspected of supporting the Viet Cong. Now, what's interesting is that one person who headed up the Phoenix program was William Colby, and when he came back to the United States in the 1970s to become director of Central Intelligence, and this seems to be just when the serial killer phenomenon was really getting off the ground or peaking in the United States. Now, one objective of this program would be, if it was some sort of domestic application of the Phoenix program, again, just like in Vietnam, in America, was to traumatize and demoralize the public for some sort of political objective. In this case, perhaps the atomization of society, the promotion of the police state. Well, what I mean by atomization of society is if these predators are out there menacing the country, sort of random killings occurring, people could become more fearful to go out and maybe communicate with one another. There'd be less. One example would be that parents would be more protective of their children. So children aren't going to be will be more supervised. They'll be less free to roam and do things that maybe a previous generation were allowed to do. This creates a certain atomization. This also coincides with the atomization of entertainment. Of course, television was well advanced by then, I think by a couple of decades. But culture and entertainment in general became more atomized. And this, again, this could be an attempt to destroy or prevent the formation of real communities, so as to make a society that was more malleable, more vulnerable to the psychological warfare that was being unleashed on them through the entertainment, through the wars, through the crises. And again, this would maybe affect some sort of alchemical process that would break down communities and make them, more malleable or more controllable for the central planners.
Yeah, I mean that's there were lots of assassination programs going on. You have I think you have various factions within the the intelligence community and things like that. So you have you have a number of these like weathermen. You have, of course, just also ties into like Gladio too. But so you have you do have assassination programs going on within certain. For example, the Black Panthers and things like that. Mm-hmm. So that going on, but at the same time, you also have, which I would describe as perhaps more has possibly more ramifications. Is that this is also connected with a number of this is connected with it goes back, of course, Aleister Crowley is the guy that, that his motto, "Do What Thou Wilt," was basically the template for the 1960s. And so his shadow was cast and sort of helps to link the 60s rock artist and some of these other organizations, such as the Process Church and many others, not only with Crowley's ideas, but also with the freedom lifestyle, with this dissolution of boundaries, this hermaphrodite culture, this there's a morality of one. Whatever you decide is right. You are this concept of freedom. But then there's also this obviously Crowley, even though he was an MI6 agent, he also supposedly was quite he had lots of what appeared to be powers to implant thoughts in their people's minds or do things that appeared to be, some kind of psychic phenomena he undertook. But, when we tie that in there, then we see that there's a boom in the interest in the occult, in the what would be described as the satanic with the or the the expansion of pleasure to the furthest quadrant, and maybe that expansion of pleasure involves sadomasochism. Maybe it involves ritual murder. Who knows? I mean, so you see a softening up to. And also destruction of foundational philosophical concepts as part of this as well. So,
Well, like objective morality or reality.
objective morality and reality, but
Yeah.
also there's a you have this this sort of temptation being offered. So with Kenneth Anger,
Through rock music too, like groups like Led Zeppelin, right? This excess, the celebration of excess, right?
yeah, well, I mean, the Rolling Stones were very much involved in the occult. Kenneth Anger was an associate of of Crowley, or was connected. It was considered to be the heir of Aleister Crowley, and he was involved at a very young age as a child star, involved in making very kind of crazy films, and so. And you have also, the Beatles and all this stuff. And even John Lennon talks about Aleister Crowley as one of his heroes and, and all this stuff. So these ideas became part of you call it, what do you call it? The atmosphere, the environment.
Zeitgeist.
The cultural ecology sort of the hippie movement. As soon as you start breaking down barriers, then why not? Then maybe evil is not bad. Maybe there's, maybe this is actually cool and it's good, or so. And there's other, people didn't necessarily go along with that, but
And doesn't the process church believe that it's actually necessary?
yes, yeah, and then you tie that back into like Zabbatai, who believe that by doing evil, by murdering or having incestuous orgies and all this other stuff, you're actually bringing the coming of the what do you call it, the second coming of the the new world or whatever, the God coming to Earth or God's agent or something. So bringing about essentially the end of the world, bringing about the new spiritual world by committing evil, and that's sort of the premise of the process church.
It's eschatology, I guess you could. Yeah.
Well, eschatology, like the eschatology. That would be It's sort of it's a millennial religion in that it's focused towards an end time. So the eschatology, is a study of the end days in various religions. But in this case,
you can speed it up.
The Sabbateans, well, it's like a process. It's actually similar to this alchemical process of transforming human consciousness, but actually in a certain way you can look at it as to create the gold of the elites. You're also going to, ravage the minds of the masses. But anyways, stay back on track here. So you also have, Rosemary's Baby, and so Rosemary's Baby, of course, is tied in with the famous Manson family killings, right? And so and Rosemary's Baby is connected with this idea that Crowley had of giving birth to the moon child, right? Of having this divine child that would basically be like the Antichrist or the Whore of Babylon or whatever. And this ritual was actually undertaken by Jack Parsons, who ran the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and of course the great scientist of rocketry. But so this, again, California. Similar areas, but basically, so you have this underground current becoming very mainstream through the popular entertainment, through the musicians themselves promoting it, or say in the case of the Grateful Dead, I would say encoding it, not necessarily promoting it on the stage, and then you have Anton LaVey with his Church of Satan, which he says he's an atheist, and this is basically like just do what you want to do, and it's just a church of freedom. But there's some there's some evidence that Anton LaVey is actually one of these mind control agents or programmers, MK Ultra programmer. But anyways, so all these elements are going on, and you basically have right as the 60s, the Summer of Love takes off, you have the release of Rosemary's Baby, Um, which came out in June 12th, 1968. 6-3, got a nice 9 there in 1968. Um, and then, just prior to that, you have Sergeant Pepper's and their Satanic Majesty's Request. You have Rolling Stones going from being kind of an R&B band to being a sort of an occult psychedelic band, which didn't last long, thank goodness. It was pretty rough album. But you also have, and then at the same time, um, you have you have this, you know, again, as there is this freedom of consciousness coming about, and we can change the world and all this stuff, and I guess people really believed it, right? They saw this being in this amazing time of freedom. Suddenly have in December 1968, and I guess as you're saying, it's possible the process killings went back earlier, but the first one where they were getting this stuff published in the newspaper, you have December 1968 right there. You have the Zodiac killer terrifying the Bay Area and other parts of California. I don't know if you want to say something about the Zodiac killer. I can keep going, but
Well, one thing is the Zodiac killings occurred in California, which was a hotbed of MK Ultra activity. But some have theorized, although speculated, that at least a few of the killings were staged or faked. We have this one case of Sherry Jo Bates, who was reportedly murdered in 1966, and was her death was suspected or linked to the Zodiac killer. But an anomaly there is that apparently there's a photograph taken of her at the University Library the evening she was murdered, and I was reading an article about the Zodiac killer by Miles Mathis, and he theorizes the whole thing was a stage thing. I don't know if I accept that thesis. But what he says in the article is, what are the odds of the local newspaper taking a photograph of Sherry Jo Bates the evening she was murdered and having that? It's just foreknowledge of her murder, or at least her reported murder. But at the very least, I think if you look at the evidence, that I think the Zodiac killer was probably many people, much like the Son of Sam, was sort of a psyop, targeting the American public, particularly California, the Bay Area. But much like the Son of Sam, there were probably many killers or assailants, and it wasn't just this crazy mailman looking to impress his neighbor's dog. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. So the Zodiac, you have this state of fear and paranoia
Mm-hmm.
being inculcated in the mass mind, even nationally, because they start publishing these letters, right?
Mm-hmm.
That he was writing, and so with these ciphers and stuff like that. So you've got this, which is creating a great sense of fear. At the same time, you have the fear which is arising from the explosion of the counterculture for mainstream America, which was extremely disturbing, right? I mean, you had this was going on. I mean, and so it was disturbing, and now when you see the retrospectives on the 60s are like, oh yeah, they believed, they had all these like reactionary people that believed LSD was bad, and they had all this propaganda of people losing their minds and da da da. Well, no, I mean, you had lots of people losing their minds at the same time. You had this people are following this in the newspaper. There's an incredible aura of fear. At the same time, you have this bad LSD start to be distributed, including STP, Serenity, Tranquility, and Peace, made by Mr. Owsley Stanley and Tim Scully. And the thing about STP is that it is STP, with a very small dose, will produce a sort of a psychedelic trip, but it originally was called DOM. But Mr. Owsley, Mr. Peace, Love, and Happiness, hippie family, Grateful Dead, is distributing this drug that can cause 24 hours, mass intense psychosis and fear. It induces psychosis, incredible fear, paranoia, and things like that. So it's the exact opposite of Serenity tranquility and peace. And so again, so you look at that environment. I don't know if you want to just talk a little bit about Michael Hoffman's take on the Zodiac killers, because I think he has quite an interesting take on that. But I'm just throwing in this idea that you also have around the same time the serial killers are starting. You start to get these batches of LSD that are bad, like at Woodstock.
Yeah.
And that was distributed by another connection with Merry Pranksters. Wavy Gravy, Hugh Romney with his hog farm commune. Distributing bad LSD. And then, of course, we'll talk about Altamont in a second. And that's another case where you have, quote unquote, bad LSD being distributed. But I don't know if you want to say something about Hoffman's take on the Zodiac killers.
Well, firstly, about observation in general about the serial killer phenomenon is the fear that it induces. Zodiac victims of 4, 5, or 6, I think, over the course of 4 years. There's a scene in the movie The Zodiac where Robert Graysmith, the cartoonist for the Chronicle, I think, who got obsessed with the case, and he's talking to one of the reporters who worked the case for a while, long since moved on, and he doesn't really care about the case anymore. And the reporter says to him, says, "How many people did Zodiac allegedly kill?" He goes, 4, 5, 6. That many people died last week on the highways, and more people died in the highways in California in a week. Okay, and same thing can be said about Son of Sam. I think Son of Sam had 8 victims, 6 of whom died, I think, if I get my numbers right. Now, this was between 1975 and 1977. Now, how many homicides occurred in New York during that time? A few thousand, maybe. So why is it that people are so obsessed? I mean, the psychological impact of this, although statistically speaking, you being a victim of a serial killer is so small, you're much more likely to get killed in a car accident. But nevertheless, the psychological impact of that idea that there's a guy out there stalking random people creates creates fear and atomizes society. I had talking to a friend. He went to New York City with his father in 1976, 77, and his father told him in the car to duck as he went to visit his uncle. And he was worried about the Son of Sam killer. And really, statistically speaking, it's far more likely to get harmed driving to New York City than being in New York City and just waiting, or get harmed by somebody else, for that matter, random street crime. So that's the psychological effect of these things, where it gets people off the streets and gets them all paranoid. And that's when you mentioned the idea of introducing sort of bad LSD or STP into the community, where it promotes paranoia. This could be a way, again, of promoting fear and paranoia into the community through this figure of the serial killer.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I mean, also, what you're doing is, at the same time, you have people doing, work. People are taking all these, psychological, drugs. So they're actually, a lot of times, they're in sort of a cosmic state. They're seeing entities, or they're maybe participating in different kinds of cults or whatever, and things like that. And so then you add something like, and then the Zodiac killer, which, again, ironically enough, the first name of the Grateful Dead was the Zodiacs.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the first name of their band, and their second name was the Warlocks. So so you have this fear being induced. But also not only fear, but especially when you're looking at bad LSD, you're also having, people losing their minds. You have people permanently becoming insane. I mean, you're wiping out people, or you're creating a class of people that are psychologically damaged. And I think I mentioned this earlier, that when you are in a state of fear, you're much more suggestible. It's very possible to implant ideas in your subconscious that you either act on later, or they will start to shape how you perceive things. But at the same time, that with stress and fear, it's bad for the brain. It's bad for your cognitive abilities. It slows down your ability to process complex information. It also it also it creates a desire to seek some kind of external stability or sanctuary, which could be found in, different areas or, and things like that. So it's really having a quite, if you look at it as kind of a wrenching of society, or just as, getting your hopes up and then dashing them, then getting them up again and dashing them. You're seeing quite a powerful, undertaking that's being presented to the culture. And then when you add in the component of, whether or not, these elites or people actually believe in these occult phenomena, it certainly seems like they do, whether it's as the posited Anton LaVey thing that this is just a fun little get up I'm wearing, and this is all for fun, and we're just, it's basically sort of a Nietzschean philosophy that he's a Nietzschean, it's like a Nietzschean libertarian hedonistic philosophy. But I've heard an interview with one of his members of his church, a prominent member of the Church of Satan. She was talking about even before he started that, he would have these different gatherings where, and sometimes they would take psychedelics, but they would talk about, witchcraft or astrology. And then at one of them, they actually had a cannibalism and they actually ate human flesh. And that's what she's saying. And she's, and she said that they legally obtained human meat. And so, you have this level, but then you also have the level of the indoctrination, the destruction of you could describe as the authoritarian personality of the Christian church, which, whether or not, I'm sure Joe, Atwell's not a huge fan of Christianity, but it did serve as a help to develop Western civilization and culture in a lot of ways, and also created some kind of moral code to what, and we can maybe argue either way, but a destruction of basically any, not only external relationality, but internal ground, which creates this, it almost starts creating a semi-psychotic, paranoid undercurrent in the society as a whole. And then, as we look at the process church, I'll just briefly talk about two other events here. One thing to note is the process church sign is a little bit similar to that of the Zodiac killer, right? It's You got a circle through the cross through it. But the process church was a very strange and mysterious organization that was an outgrowth of L. Ron Hubbard Dianetics. So you have the whole Scientology, and then from there we have a nice little link right directly back to Jack Parsons, Aleister Crowley, the OTO, etc. But
doesn't also tie back to the Presidio base. Wasn't the first black mass of the process church held on Presidio property?
You know what? I've heard that. Have you found that that's the case? I don't know.
I haven't confirmed it, but that's what I hear it repeated. That's over there in the land. It's also interesting that the land right off the base there, of course, the Presidio sex scandal and being tied to to Colonel Aquino.
And he was he created his own outgrowth of the Church of Satan.
And Colonel Aquino, by the way, wrote the psychological warfare doctrine for the Pentagon.
Yeah, and he's a general, right? I mean, and
also head chaplain too, by the way.
Oh God.
So I mean,
and so
you think we're nuts for seriously considering that the military intelligence CIA would develop schemes like this. Well, the people who are writing their psychological warfare doctrine are devout Satanists. So, call me crazy. So I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, and then you see the same sort of genealogy. And then, of course, all these guys these ideas are floating around, and they're all, a lot of people became involved in I'm going back to the Church of Satan there, but let me backtrack to the process church. So the process church, again, coming out of Dianetics, which was, you know, you're that's a whole nother topic of of one of those guys. It's just a guy with some very sketchy connections, and who's also basically developing and working on control of individuals, mind control stuff, and just some kind of. I guess he was very There's what's that? There's a movie about him, sort of loosely based on him, where this guy gets on his boat or something. Forget the name of that movie, the Magician or something. We got a movie based on him, but L. Ron Hubbard was an absolute, he wrote science fiction novels, but he was a very, very manipulative person. I mean, the Church of Scientology is based on this invented religion that he created, sort of a science based cult, utilizing utilizing a bunch of different mind control techniques. And again, again, the founder himself, like, I guess, according to his son, he used to have his son attend orgies with him, but he used to do this like ritual thing with beating some kind of psychological abuse and physical and sexual abuse to a woman, which was called soul cracking. And he said, by doing that, he could like suck the energy out of a woman. The woman wouldn't die, but he would like do this like very, dark, occult, violent ritual to basically suck out the souls of women. So so this is where the Process Church was founded. And while the Process Church developed, and it basically became popular, it was run in England. And they developed, they came up with, they were very much, connected with the psychedelic culture. They made an active effort to recruit musicians and artists to work with them and be part of their group. And they were founded, or I mean, they were, I think they were greatly influenced by the founder. Robert E. Grimson and his experiments with LSD, having these kind of cosmic experience and starting this church. But the long and short of it is that the Process Church became part of the sort of the scenery in swinging London, and they had these very kind of strange robes they used to wear. Their dark robes, and they would recruit people. They had all these mimeographed books they would give out to people in different pamphlets. And again, remember at this time, we've had several years, even going back to the early 60s, of people using LSD, of, being in a space where they're sort of aware of what they would describe as a spiritual dimension and vibes. But basically what they've done as, by taking the LSD, one thing that happens, or you have these cosmic consciousness experiences, your actual day-to-day life becomes meaningless, right? You suddenly, you want to always be in this exalted state, but then everything around you, and part of the whole hippie thing, right, was seeing through and deconstructing the society. But they would go out in their black coats with, goat of Mendes on their jackets and stuff. And they did got, people like Paul McCartney, the Funkadelic, I think the album with Maggot Brain has the text from the Process Church inside the album. So they provided an interesting group that that involved music, involved lifestyle, and involved the doctrine of the leader, which basically states that there's four. It's Christ, Lucifer, Jehovah, and Satan, or something like that. So you have these four different polarities, and you have to worship all of them. So even though it's ostensibly sort of has a Christian veneer, and they can even bring people in with that, they certainly were very much involved with invoking also these dark energies of Satanism or whatever, and they were also this idea that these two figures, Christ and Satan, would be worshiping them simultaneously. This idea of sort of, you have this millennial, or this idea of bringing the end of the world, and having, there are all this other stuff. Well, they were very much connected with the Manson killings, um, and that Manson supposedly borrowed elements of the Process Church. There's connections of the Process Church with the Finders, and several other types of organizations. So they're sort of seen as this underground. On the surface, they had their split and all this stuff, and they ended up falling apart by the mid '70s. But they're definitely linked, not only with the psychedelic rock culture. And again, they were there in swinging London, and they recruited all these hippies, or just people that were part of the scene. They also have some connections, and some have posited very deep connections with the whole deployment of the serial killer, again, phenomena.
One of the things that Dave McGowan does in Program to Kill, his book about the phenomenon of the serial killer, is he links these serial killers to U.S. military and intelligence. Very much the same thing he did with the rock bands in Lower Canyon, with their connections to military and intelligence. But let me mention a few names. What he points out that it was, I think, Jeffrey Dahmer was in the U.S. military. David Berkowitz was in the U.S. military. Arthur Shawcross was in the U.S. military, served in Vietnam, and I think was part of the Phoenix program. And Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker in L.A., I think his cousin was in the U.S. military, and reportedly encouraged him or trained him to do some of the sadistic things he did. So you have those connections. But again, I think, as we talked about earlier, is the objective of this program would be to traumatize the American public. Again, we talked about Phoenix. Phoenix was there to terrorize the Vietnamese peasants, and to undermine support for the Viet Cong. Now, what this is part of a plan to analyze, or to exploit a community's, I guess, fears, anxieties, superstitions, perhaps, in order to more easily control them or conquer them. This was also part of what Gregory Bateson, I think it's been called weaponized anthropology. Both he and his spouse, Margaret Mead, learned to weaponize anthropology, study a society's culture and habits, or customs, in order to use it against them. Again, what would obviously a strategy for this would be very different, to say, in a war-torn third world country like Vietnam, than, say, in a developed nation, or perhaps the United States, a domestic application. So it'd be applied differently, but the strategy, at least objective, would be the same. Again, we talked about the atomization of society. What would this do? This breaks down community. This also coincides, what we're talking about is the weakening of the nuclear family, of traditional communities. This, I guess, renders society more vulnerable to social engineering, perhaps to corporate monoculture, because once you break down authority, traditions, or local customs, or communities, then they can be subjected to the corporate monoculture. We're seeing something similar being play in Europe and also the Middle East, where you have this migration crisis, which is born out of the wars that are being waged by NATO and the Anglosphere in Libya or Syria, and you have this mass migration into Europe at the time. This this is causing tension. This is part of a strategy of tension. It's creating strife. Again, undermining the undermining these societies. Well, we've also had statements of people like Peter Sutherland, who's from Goldman Sachs, and also Wesley Clark, former NATO commander, saying that the time of the ethnically based European country is over, and they have to be, I guess, become more multicolored, I guess you could say, or say more diversified. Again, you're destroying the ethnic base of these societies. This is a strong basis for a society, or for a country, or for a community. And once you do that, you sort of an alchemical process kicks in. you break it down. Once you break it down, it can be rebuilt and be made to be I guess make it more malleable or make it conform to the globalist monoculture that can then be more easily controlled from the center.
Yeah, and at the same time, you have this. You have a churning, right? You have, whether you believe like you and Cameron that mental afflictions, or these psychological contagions can eventually pass down genetically. There is evidence that trauma can be genetically passed down. At the same time, you have the foundational. I believe this. Maybe I'm wrong, but I do think that generally speaking, people don't want to harm and hurt other people. They don't want to, kill people, or they don't necessarily won't necessarily feel the need on their own to engage in, in total licentious orgiastic sex, or completely need to shatter or smash the society around them, or things like that. But the thing is, this is part of the blender effect. I would describe as there's different blades of the blender, and in this case, if you look at all these different movements, and then we've all the stuff we've discussed thus far, and then you look at there's a combination of degradation of like fear and pleasure, or fear and breaking down the society, or the fear, and then so you end up is a debasement also of human society, where you're going to accept things. Look at Weimar Republic Germany. You go down these certain periods in time where you have very much the society becoming completely sexualized and debased, and just really leading, kind of wiping out a lot of the ability to make judgments, creating this addictive type of behavior that just like a heroin addict or something else. A heroin addict, if he needs his fix, he'll kill. Not saying that I'm not making that level of leap there, but I'm saying that all these things, with the degradation of society, with the imposition of fear, with the confusion of what you actually perceive, right? So you have something where it should be obvious to anybody. If you state the obvious, you're a racist. Like, for example, if I say that European people, the homeland of European people is Europe. So maybe there should be some limits to the amount of foreign populations that you're going to bus in there, especially when it's being done in this, not an overtime immigration. We're talking about huge populations. Well, if I even say that, I'm now suddenly moved from being a normal guy. Now I'm a racist, because I give the right to a specific country. This is actually the birthland of this particular group, to have some kind of immigration restrictions. I spent a lot of time in India. There's not a lot of immigrants. It's very hard to get a permanent visa in India. It's very difficult. It's not easy. China, Japan. I mean, yes, they allow immigration, but they create this level of maintaining. Just where I live. I mean, I'm wonderful Columbus, Ohio, and I've just seen the street be transformed in the past like 3-4 years, with hundreds of thousands of populations being dropped in, and including again, you can just call me a racist, but I mean, I just think this is just my own observation. When they're running human trafficking rings, and they have prostitution, and you have these, this entire area is just completely changed. And I'm like, well, was anyone asked when you wanted to bus in hundreds of thousands of people? But in the States, it's much bigger. But you look at Europe with these small, tightly knit countries, and of course you can make the argument that America was, we killed all the Indians, so we deserve it or something. But the inability to make judgments that just should be common sense, the inability to understand what's going on around you, or that your reason has been so scrambled, or that you're just, or on the other level too, you get this, you get these very malleable populations that can be goaded into various mass movements, like, well, again, Pokemon Go or Black Lives Matter or whatever other types of just those came to mind, but instantaneously create these movements out of nowhere, and just mobilize people almost like robots following the beck and call of the media without them being able to have any kind of critical judgment. Or also, I guess what I was trying to allude to is like this blender effect. I mean, you have human history evolving over thousands of years. You're able to do things that, would be very difficult. I mean, you have cultures that have survived in diaspora for the Farsis in India or whatever. They've been there for 2,000 years. They still have their unique culture has survived. So, with a living culture, there's something very resilient about that. But this is a level of really erasing. It's really erasing memory too. It's erasing the ability to think. It's erasing the ability to naturally connect with the world, to even know what's wrong and what's happening. And then basically it becomes this state of constantly pumping in the fear. And obviously you can see that quite easily with the current our current society right now. I mean, it's pretty much every day there's another event. It's kind of like almost every hour. It seems like there's some terror event, and just go fly on a plane. It's some places you go there. It's flying has become unpleasant. All these things we're not only conditioned to the police state, but we've also sort of removed people's ability to critically differentiate. Not only driving them towards Big Brother, but also I wouldn't say erasing ancestral memory, but I would say that somehow trying to, remove the final shards of sort of cultural memory or human memory that like I said, I think if this stuff was tried, in a past decade, if it wasn't for the 1960s, all this stuff we're seeing today could not have been rolled out.
Yeah. You needed to break up the ethnic neighborhoods, create suburbia, create the white diaspora, to create this sort of this bland middle class that had no ethnic identity, no ethnic memory. They're just white middle class, and all they have in common are what's on television. And so at that point, they're much more malleable or vulnerable to further efforts, whether it's music or marketing, programming, or products themselves, turn these people into sort of these deracinated consumers, who then can be thrown into perpetual debt and be more or less be harvested through their entire lives until they retire and killed off through modern medicine. But that seems to be the process that's going on here. You mentioned that if you make the case that a certain community, like an ethnic neighborhood or a country for that matter, that kind of defines itself on the basis of that ethnicity, if it wants to defend itself or assert its right to exist, they'll say you're being a racist, and that's absurd. It's more or less you're being condemned for what you are and what your culture is. A good important point is important point here is who is bussing in these people? Who's paying for it?
Well, there's a lot of money. There's tons of money, but then you have this, and then look, then you have the rape phenomena. You have this other stuff going on, but also if you look at it, like for example, I may have mentioned this when I talked to you before, but in the black community, you have a very obvious and in fact direct. I think we may have talked about this or talked with someone else, but. You have this after the Black Panthers are kind of wiped out. You have the agent, who's working for Time Life Publishing, who's the photographer, who's also a CIA agent infiltrating these organizations, and his son. Unfortunately, his name will probably pop in my head. I'm forgetting his name, but
Gordon Parks.
Gordon Parks, yeah, we thought it was. Yeah, so Gordon Parks' son, starts putting out blaxploitation movies. Well, there you go.
Superfly and
and suddenly look at that, and so you have this growth of crime, et cetera, et cetera. So, obviously this is a successful model, but but I think there's also a level of it too, where you're conditioning people to accept evil. Or to lose their innate sense of compassion, whether that's a natural human phenomena, whether that's a legacy of Christianity or other religions, but you're removing this innate compassion or just respect that without which the society will eventually become a total anarchy, or then you just, this whole, erasure again of just obviously if you get along with people, things are going to be better. If you have, a functioning society, it feels better to have nice relationships. It feels better to be connected with people than to be disconnected.
Mm-hmm.
It feels better to experience positive emotions as opposed to rage, fear, and then your brief, your brief explosions of pleasure. And so, I think that there's also, this, by creating, there's a desire to escape, right? So you have this aversive stimuli, which is whether it's the Altamont killings, where you have this on the exact anniversary of the 60th anniversary of Aleister Crowley summoning the demon chronozone, or something that's supposed to be this very powerful demonic entity that he was not able to put back in. And then Timothy Leary, who had just on another anniversary of that same invocation of the deity, had just relived that experience himself in the exact location in the Algerian desert. And then you have a ritual sacrifice at the Altamont concert. And so that's like a ritual murder right there. Some would say maybe the guy didn't die. I'm not going to speculate on, but you have, and it's filmed. It's a film, snuff film. It creates this thing. But then, so
isn't George Lucas who films it?
No, George Lucas was a cameraman.
Yeah.
He was a cameraman, but in the movie itself, it's considered sort of like a postmodern thing because you see the Rolling Stones looking at the footage themselves and talking about it. Right. But they changed it was done during the song Sympathy for the Devil. You got Kenneth Anger, again, the crawling guy in the background. Keith Richards was supposed to star as Satan in the film Lucifer Rising. And then again, you have Timothy Leary dropping down, being there right backstage on this extremely important, at least for these Crowleyan OTO people, this extremely important date. But at the same time, this Altamont was really considered the final crushing of the peace, love, and 1960s vibe. It's like it's like the bookend, just like the crash of the Big Bopper and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But it became a cultural bookend, and then of course you have you got the Manson murders too, and then then you have this guy, this hippie commune cult leader, suddenly having these horrific murders, murdering of pregnant women, these celebrities. And then Manson, of course, we could go on and on with Manson, but Manson was majorly connected with the 1960s rock royalty. He was very good friends with Brian Wilson. He was friends with Neil Young. He was, he actually, was a decent musician as well. And what was very, he would procure girls for all these rock stars and stuff. So he was definitely a player and a recognized figure and someone with some power in the rock in the rock world, and not just some obscure figure, because he had all these again, you need your father figures, right? So he was an older guy and served as a father figure for all these for these hippies, and especially these young females. And so he had basically this stable of semi-mind controlled not sex slaves, but he was farming them out. And of course they were heavily involved in LSD. And then you have, of course, the message "Helter Skelter" being written on the on the ceiling. And then you have that taking place on the anniversary of Hiroshima, which then ties back into all the other. And we could tie that back into that whole. There's all that stuff with the Manhattan Project, et cetera. And then that also ties in with the fact that I don't know if we mentioned this yet, but that Anton LaVey had a ceremony. He hated hippies, right? I guess he considered himself kind of conservative, and so he did a satanic ritual to to kill the hippie movement on the same day as the Manson murders.
Because in the eyes of the press, it did that. Yeah.
So, but in the eyes of the people, and again, let's keep in mind that we're not dealing with 400 cable TV channels and internet. We're dealing with you got your radio stations, you've got some newspapers, you might have your smaller underground newspapers and magazines, and you've got like 3-4 TV stations. That's it. That's your entire media consciousness. So it's it's not as diverse as it is now. So it's it's quite possible to have these major events to do that, and then just to, if you look at the again initial trauma, then the Beatles being the first sort of palliative for that trauma, with the Beatles, everyone going nuts for the Beatles. Notice how the trauma, people will escape into something and they're open for these other things. And then you have, of course, all the way through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, all the way up until about 2001, you have these spate of serial killers all over the media, everywhere, tons and tons of serial killers, right? There's no shortage of them. We could just go on and on. It was on TV all the time. You've got slasher movies. You have, in the late 80s and 90s, you have, the bestseller list being dominated by movies about serial killers, and then et cetera. So, you have this transition and you have this integration. And at the same time, there becomes this subtle support, sort of not deification, but someone looking at the serial killer as being this like very powerful person, right? They're able to do this. There's like Hannibal Lecter or whatever, so there's there's sort of a weird sort of what do you call it? A promotion, a little bit of that. But you have so many of these,
superpowers almost. They can outsmart the police. Mock.
Yeah. And how do they just keep doing it? And then who was it? The guy, one of these guys, was it? Some of these guys. I mean, serial killers. You can just go down the list. They get put in jail and they get released like 2 days, 3 days later.
That was
so many of them.
Yeah, that was the one piece of evidence suggesting that these serial killers have some sort of protection. One case was Henry Lee Lucas, who was a convicted murderer who confessed or claimed to be guilty of hundreds of murders. Well, of all people to be on death row in Texas, he was the only one to receive a clemency from George W. Bush. An odd choice. What's interesting, he was, for a time, was teamed up with Otis Toole. Otis Toole, another serial killer. He confessed to the murder of Adam Walsh. If you recall, Adam Walsh was the young boy who went missing in the Sears down there in Florida around, I guess it was 1981, and they eventually found his severed head floating in a canal nearby, which seems to suggest maybe some sort of satanic killing. But Otis Toole apparently confessed to that murder, but he was taken in as a suspect a few years after the murder, and apparently the police had a machete and the car that apparently he may have kidnapped Adam, used to kidnap Adam. They lost the machete and the car as evidence, and they were forced to release Otis Toole. So that's a strange anomaly there. Again, more inexplicable incompetence on the part of the police. We have Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer, there was a story when the police, delivered the naked boy back to Jeffrey Dahmer. The boy had escaped from the apartment, and I think two pedestrians had seen the boy, got the police, and they went back to the apartment, and they just let the boy walk back in the apartment where Jeffrey Dahmer eventually killed him. It's just inexplicable. Another thing with Jeffrey Dahmer is there's a story that Dave McGowan tells where I think in the late 70s, he was on a senior trip to Washington, D.C., and he told his classmates that just on the basis of a phone call, he'd get them a tour of the vice president's office. And he reportedly went to a public phone and called and got his class a tour of the vice president's office. A little strange. You have also John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy he was big in local Democratic politics, I think in Illinois, and he was able to meet or sit beside Rosalind Carter, the then First Lady, at a dinner, and he had a pin on him indicating that he had security clearance from Secret Service. At that time, he was already a convicted sex offender. And apparently also during the investigation of some of the missing boys in the area, the police went to his house and they found artifacts belonging to one of the missing boys, and they reportedly smelled something coming from the basement. This is the crawl space where apparently he was hiding some of the bodies, and they did nothing. They left him, didn't arrest him, and he was able to go on, I guess, for a few more months. Of course, we have I think we mentioned earlier the case of Marc Dutroux in Belgium, where he was an unemployed electrician who was given a pension from the parliament there, and also a a virtually unlimited prescription to Rohypnol, the date rape drug. He also ran apparently a string of houses. This is again, he's an unemployed electrician on a pension, and there's no explanation where he got the resources to do this. Of course, the indication are there that he was a procurer. You know, so
Yeah, and that's one of those things where looks like there's very high level.
yes, NATO and things like that.
Yeah, high level government.
And NATO and human trafficking goes back to the Balkans and things like that. So if you investigate, drugs and human trafficking through NATO, through Brussels via their operations in the Balkans. This explains maybe part of the motivation for the Balkans, for the war against Serbia in the late 90s. So you have that. This is why when we talk about the phenomenon of the serial killer, it's not just we're talking about the broad sociological effects of it and these things. Also, there are definite links to intelligence, inexplicable police incompetence, suggesting some sort of protection in all these cases. This is why, why people suspect this connection.
Yeah, and then just to push a little further too. I mean, you have of course, this idea of revelation of the method. You give little clues. There is some evidence. That you're looking at this sort of these national, international rituals being performed on the population.
Which is what Michael Hoffman gets into somewhat.
Yeah, and if you just look at even the ritual process, what Joe Campbell talks about, look at the 1960s as this ritual journey, but then of course where you're arriving at, so it's almost like an attempt to program the archetypal level of the consciousness, and I think that it's I think that it's obviously there's societies are very complex and there's many different components and all that, but I think that if you look at some of these revolutionaries, their idea of destabilizing, like Frankfurt School, destabilize it internally, let it rot internally. And let's just throw in Jimmy Savile, if you're talking about pedophilia, directly connected with pop music, all this stuff, and all these other, these musicians, either being promoted, some of them being linked to that. So you start to see, it depends how far you want to go with it, but, it does appear that, you're looking at a very integrated system or network, and and even then you look at what was it? Even the pedophilia. I mean, that's next on the list to be legalized. I mean, they're pushing for that. There was a Ellen DeGeneres episode about some little girl, who heard some cheeseball new modern pop singer, and she arranged for her to meet him and said he wanted to marry him and spend the night with her. She's like 4 or 5 years old, and even younger, and they're showing this on TV, and this idea that pedophilia is something that they're sort of trying to allow that to come into the acceptance.
Yeah, all that is done rather gradually. One thing is through fashion. Clothing, whereas you can't find a modest bathing suit or even the clothes that that tweens wear now are very sexualized. And this is one. Here's an interesting connection to the Jeffrey Epstein case, the convicted billionaire pedophile that's been tied to both Trump and Bill Clinton. But one of his friends, at least one of his benefactors, this guy Wexler.
Les Wexner, right?
Who owns the Limited, right?
Right, yeah, right down. Well, not down the street, but right here in Ohio, yeah.
Yeah. So, and his clothing, if you look at the clothing line, it's very sexual. It's very revealing for young girls. The music, some of the pop stars. I mean, look at Britney Spears and some of her videos. "Hit Me, Baby, One More Time," her dancing around in a little Catholic schoolgirl outfit. There's this other pop star named Adriana Grande, I think. Have you familiar with her?
No, I'm not.
She's just a typical pop singer in many ways. But I was watching, saw an earlier video of hers, and she looks like she's like 13 years old. She's really 24, but she's dolled up. I mean, she looks like a little girl, and it's disturbing to watch.
Well, I mean, look at Miley Cyrus. I mean, she went in just a matter of months. I mean, her latest stuff, I mean, she's like, just like bondage, total,
Yeah,
basically
yeah,
total slut, degradation, like of basically her concerts are now like pornography. And I mean, just from twerking or whatever to just, I mean, you see her latest images. I mean, it's just basically pornographic pictures. She has danced around with
yep,
this. She's a giant penis statue thing that she
yeah,
uses on stage, and actually stimulates sex with her female bandmates. And that's just in a couple of years. I mean, we're not looking at something that took, she pretty much, that transformation happened very rapidly. Then you have the Robin Thicke, the older guy, in his
yeah,
40s, the young girl, and so yeah, so this this whole process. But again, I would argue that I think that by promoting the fear, you suspend people's judgment. You also are able to instill kinds of ideas, maybe in the subconscious. And then on the other hand too, it's like you end up with nowhere to run. And so then you create this sort of almost, there's no more church, there's no religion, you can go out and, protest microaggressions or something, but really, end up in this very much empty space without any real grounding, either on a cognitive level, on an emotional level, you could say even on a spiritual or psychological level, but also in the society. And just to finally tie it into what you said is a whole debt slave culture. And just look at the education system, where this is a big payoff. You got these, costing $100,000 or $50,000 for an undergrad education you can't get a job with, or else you could join the military. And all this money is being funneled into the administrative classes, while they're paying half the, I forget the exact percentage, but a pretty large percentage of faculty are now just adjuncts, who are basically temp laborers. You get a PhD and you end up, getting paid more, as much as you get paid at McDonald's to
yeah,
teach a next level course,
yeah,
where the administrators are making 6+ figures, but then the students are getting locked into this. It's a debt feudalism that's going on, and so. Anyway, so we keep going on, but so I think that again, with the serial killers, it's definitely, I would say, definitely linked. Because there were other serial killers, right? I mean, obviously they didn't just start with the Zodiac killer, but you have the promotion of this as a media event, as something that is creating other events, and again, in like a ritualistic context, or like almost like taking a space of time and demarcating that out. Like you have five points, like an upside down star. You look at the Zodiac, so you're almost creating these blocks of time, which are sort of looped off by themselves and become these kind of miniature experiential zones, right? And then these can be juggled around and rejuggled around later. 1960s is an early, example of that. You create these sort of almost like mythological eras or bounded things, and you have this cultural grouping that you can roll that out again. You can roll that out in other countries, even like rock again being used for revolution in various countries around the world and things like that. And then you create this sort of this mythology. So instead of actually having a mythology, you have a mythos based on these kind of constructed historicities that are then can be jumbled and rejumbled, kind of like Herman Hesse's The Glass Bead Game, right? But then you intersperse this with these periods of fear that again reduce, if according to you and Cameron, that would be great if you want to you would actually change the entire society eventually, because as people are afraid, they'll lose their critical ability to think, their intelligence will be diminished, their memories will be diminished, they'll be highly suggestible, they'll be highly prone to escapism or prone to trusting authority, etc. So I mean, I think that it is sort of a big confluence, but I don't think that there's whether or not it's a single guiding hand behind it. We can get it, that's a whole different topic, but it certainly would seem that this process, given the fact that this is happening at the behest of the media, how many great writers or artists like Lewis Mumford, he's a great writer. How many people know who he is now? Nobody. I mean, how many of these, if you're an academic, you might know, but how many different models have just fallen by the wayside, and but I think that this permissiveness, as well as the fact that you become afraid to stand up for your culture, or unless you're on the side of the social justice warriors.
Yeah.
You're afraid. People don't even talk about politics anymore. I mean, people are afraid to say. I mean, a lot of people don't. At least in when you're around most people, I don't think they do. I think people have lost their ability to realize that, hey, I'm here on this planet. I can, I'm participating in this world around me, and stuff like that. I think people just become they're end up becoming like lab rats, actually.
Yeah. Public discourse is reduced to trivialities, and any meaningful conversation is considered too risky. And who has the gain from that, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah. Well, hey, you know what, Tim? I just looked at the time here, so I should probably.
yeah, time flew by. Listen, thanks, Hans. That was great. We covered a lot of ground. A lot of this is deep stuff. It's not as concrete as we like it to be, but that's the nature of it. We have to, deal in some level of speculation and conjecture when you're dealing with some of these things, because not like we can, issue a FOIA request and get the evidence and get true answers on these issues. Just have to look at the evidence and determine what the best inference is from the evidence. So, Hans, thanks a lot. I'll let you go for the night. And again, your website is
Hansletter.com, and then I've got mindcontrolmusic.wordpress.com. And but just to give you a little thing you said, I don't think, I mean, we could go into more detail, but I guess we're kind of doing more a survey. But I think you can definitely tie in the the 60s counterculture with some kind of mass psychological operation, and some links with certainly certain serial killers as being possibly connected with that. So I think that if you really start getting into all the names and all the details, it just becomes this massive tome. And okay, I do have to go here, so
okay.
I'm just okay.
The evidence is there, yes. If you look at it, it's not as crazy as it sounds. The evidence is there. Do the research before you pass judgment on it. So yes. Listen, thanks, and good night.
All right, yeah, great talking to you, Tim, and you have a wonderful night as well.
You too. Thank you.